We have raised a lot of questions, concerns, objections, doubts about the U.S. role in the war in Ukraine, basically from the very beginning. I remember the week of January in 2022, when this debate really began, I remember going on the show and talking constantly, and on other shows too, about how it is that every time the United States involves itself in one of these proxy wars, only bad things happen. How we're not in any way motivated by some desire to protect Ukraine, but to destroy Ukraine, because our real goal is to weaken Russia. We don't care about the Ukrainians at all. We're happy to sacrifice them and their country on the altar of our geostrategic goals. And I know that because I've seen the United States do that so many times. But the major skepticism that came not just from me or even principally from me, but from the experts that I was putting on my show, people like Jeffrey Sachs, John Mearsheimer, and Stephen Wald, and others, but principally Professor Mearsheimer, who early on kept saying, when very few people were, there's no way Ukraine can win this war without NATO and the United States entering as direct belligerents, because Russia is a much bigger and more powerful country. And maybe Russia will have some setbacks, but ultimately Russia is going to win this war no matter how bloody it turns out being, in part because Russia is bigger, but also in part because Russia perceives Western and U.S. encroachment and influence into Ukraine right on their border to be an existential threat to their country, rightly or wrongly. And that means that they will do everything they have to do to win this war, far more than what we're prepared to do. And therefore, this whole narrative that's being sold to the United States, to Americans and to the West, that we're going to vanquish every Russian troop from every inch of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea, which they seized in 2014 in response to the U.S.-supported coup. It was always impossible. It was always a pipe dream. And yet nobody, if you said that, if you said Ukraine can't win, this is a futile war, as many of us said, although not that many, then you were put on official list if you had a platform, as I was many times, as Professor Mearsheimer was, as a lot of other people were. And even if you weren't, you were accused instantly of being a Kremlin propagandist. Even though that all turned out to be exactly blatantly true, to the point where American foreign policy elites are now starting to say that, because they know they have to prepare the West to watch the United States and NATO lose the war, and they're trying to create a way to frame their loss as something other than that. Now, it doesn't mean that the war is coming to a halt or that U.S. money is stopping. In fact, just today, as Reuters reported, the U.S. is preparing another $8 billion in arms and packages for Zelensky visit, sources say. As you might recall, we reported on this on Monday night. Zelensky came to the United States. He was campaigning in swing states with Democrats like Josh Shapiro. They went to a weapons factory. Governor Shapiro, the Democrat, playfully signed the missiles and other weapons that will be used to kill people. Very fun thing that American and Israeli politicians love to do now. Nikki Haley went to Israel and did that for the Israelis, signed little happy faces on the missiles that killed children in Gaza. But here's what the Biden administration did today. Quote, President Joe Biden's administration has been engaged in urgent discussions with Congress to allow it to use another $5.6 billion in military aid for Ukraine before September 30th, the end of the federal fiscal year, when the authority was set to expire. On Thursday, U.S. officials said the White House intends to notify Congress and will move forward with the announcement of a $5.6 billion drawdown from U.S. weapons stocks. The contents of that package are still in flux, the official said. Now, last night we told you about the president of the Czech Republic, who, because of the history of the Czech Republic, which was once Czechoslovakia, often repressed by the Soviet Union, and the political party in Czechoslovakia, in the Czech Republic that is in power, has been a unyielding, vocal, steadfast supporter of Ukraine, demanding more and more Western weapons, doing everything possible, saying we have to prevent the Russians from winning, otherwise they will move into other countries. And yet even the president of the Czech Republic said yesterday, we have to start being more realistic, because this is not a war that the Ukrainians can win. And we have to really start thinking about being realistic and how to stop this war based on the reality that the Russians now occupy almost 25% of Ukrainian territory, and how to negotiate to try and get the Russians to give up at least some of that. so Ukraine doesn't end up, in the words of Professor Mearsheimer, for 2.5 years, is nothing more than a rump state, which is where it's headed. Following that pronouncement, which really did surprise me, the head of the Foreign Relations Council for the United States, Richard Haass, who is one of those people who just comes in and out of government, in the State Department and in national security offices, regardless of whether it's a Republican or Democratic president. He served in the Bush-Cheney administration. He served in Democratic administrations as well. He's just kind of the spokesman, sort of the dean of the U.S. foreign policy community, the bipartisan foreign policy community in the United States. He went on Morning Joe today, which speaks for the Biden administration. Joe Biden watches the show every day. It's kind of become ground zero for where mainstream figures go to talk about Washington. And he went on Morning Joe and said something quite remarkable when you think about how long we've been subjected to the propaganda that the only outcome we can accept is full, absolute victory as NATO and the U.S. has described it. Listen to what he said, having looked now at what's actually going on in this war.
Well, he is tapping into something, Mika, and it's one of the long traditions in America, and it's the tradition of American isolationism. That what happens over there doesn't matter, it's not worth it, it's simply cost, it takes resources away from what should be spent here. So that's essentially the tradition he's tapping into. We saw it.
I mean, isn't that amazing? By the way, that was about Donald Trump. So Mika asked him, like, what Trump seems to be increasingly reluctant to send more money. And Richard Haass said, oh, this is that evil American tradition called isolationism, which believes that we should stop sending all our money overseas to fuel wars, and instead we should spend our money here at home to improve the lives of the American people. To these kind of people, there's nothing worse than that. Using our resources not for filling the treasuries of Raytheon and General Dynamics and Boeing and fueling wars all over the place, but instead improving the lives of American communities, rebuilding infrastructure, creating more jobs. They don't care about that at all, about any of those people at all. They care about foreign wars and foreign policy. That's all they've lived their entire life focused on. But it was just amazing that in the course of attempting to depict what he calls Trump's isolationism as something sinister, the way he defined it was, oh, people like that believe we should stop spending all our money on foreign wars and instead spend it here at home. So he had to kind of give lip service to the idea that Trump is misguided, that Trump is evil. But then this is what he goes on to say about Ukraine.
Before World War II, we've seen it periodically. At other times, it's come back with surprising intensity there. Two things. One, when he talks about Russia and he talks about Napoleon, Hitler, the difference, rather fundamental difference, that's when Russia was invaded. That's when Russia was on the defense. Russia now is fighting an offensive war of aggression. Rather minor detail, so it's much harder for Putin to do what Stalin did and appeal to, if you will, Mother Russia. That said, I will say Trump, it's not in his defense, but I'll just say he makes one decent point. And
think how rare that is already. That someone like Richard Haass goes on to Morning Joe and says, okay, I spent, like 53 seconds clearing my throat about how bad Trump is. But I'm now ready to say that when it comes to what he's saying about Ukraine, he's actually having a decent point. That alone is extraordinary. And this is what he said was Trump's decent point.
It's the question of what do we mean by winning in Ukraine? It came up in the debate. It came up yesterday. It came up in President Biden's speech. It came up with what President Zelensky said. No one is putting on the table what is an achievable goal in Ukraine? If victory continues to be defined, it is by many, Mika, that Ukraine has to totally rid its country of every Russian troop. And I understand the argument for doing it. The problem is it's not achievable. No one is putting out there what is a realistic plan for victory. If we're going to spend all this money, what is our return on investment? And that's a conversation that this administration has been reluctant to have now for 2.5 years. And the danger of not having that conversation, not giving Americans an achievable policy strategy in Ukraine, is it allows someone like Donald Trump to come into the conversation and say, this can't work, I'll just end it, and so forth. So I think the administration and I think the Ukrainian government have to begin to fill the space and explain what is an achievable strategy in that country.
I mean, these people are such unbelievable scumbags, like completely rotted inside from the soul outward. I mean, there has been endless conversations about how victory is defined. He's trying to say, oh, for the last 2.5 years, we've never really defined victory. the Biden administration hasn't. Victory was defined over and over and over and over and over again for the last 2.5 years by the US government, by the EU, at NATO conferences, at conferences all over the world. Victory was defined over and over as only one thing: expelling every single Russian troop from Ukrainian soil, including not just the eastern part of Ukraine where the Russians are now dominating in those Russian-speaking areas, but also Crimea. And he even said that. He even referenced that has been the definition of victory. What is actually going on is that the West lost, NATO lost, the US lost in this war because they defined victory in such a maximalist, unachievable way that there's no way out for them because they cannot sustain the humiliation of losing to Russia. The problem from the start, it was so obvious to see, was that they defined victory in such a maximalist way that they were bound to lose. Russia would go to use nuclear weapons before it allowed, especially now, Russian forces to be expelled from Crimea or even parts of those provinces in eastern Ukraine and allow just NATO forces to overwhelm that. Russia would never allow that. And it was so obvious from the beginning. And it's very similar to what the Czech president yesterday said, too. So you can tell this is now a narrative that's emerging. Like, look, we got to start preparing the public for the fact that we're not going to win, and we can't let them know we didn't win. So we have to start revising history and saying, we never really had a clear definition of what we wanted to achieve there. And they're going to just invent some other definition like, oh, we won because we prevented Russia from taking all of Ukraine. There's still this little chunk of Ukraine that the Russians said, we don't need that. And so we won. We prevented Putin. So whatever they're going to need to do, it's going to involve whitewashing all of history. But what amazes me about this, and it happens every time in every war, in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Afghanistan, they make these sweeping proclamations to propagandize the population to accept the war, and then sometime into the war, all of those things prove to be lies. And then once they are tired of the war and know they have to end it, they start admitting the things that they had made taboo for the prior 2.5 years, such as, of course, Ukraine can't expel every Russian troop from Ukrainian soil. Something that if you said in 2022 or 2023, or basically until about 7 seconds ago, you would have been accused of being a traitor to your country. Vladimir Zelensky, and we've heard this from Ukrainian officials for a year now, is pretty much the only person on the planet who actually believes that Ukraine can still win. They basically have been saying things that are warning the Western press that he's mentally unbalanced. That he's so detached from reality that he still thinks that that Ukraine is going to win because the West encouraged that. Remember, the Russians and the Ukrainians were close to a deal to avert this horrific war, and the West swooped in and said, no, you're not going to do a deal. We're going to just give you everything you need to make sure you win. And he started believing it. And remember, democracy, elections are suspended in Ukraine indefinitely for as long as this conflict goes on, and who knows how much longer after that. So this democracy we're trying to save is not even a democracy any longer. Zelensky is this madman. And here's part of what he said at the UN yesterday.
Russia can only be forced into peace. And that is exactly what's needed, forcing Russia into peace as the sole aggressor in this war, the sole violator of the UN Charter.
He's basically there saying, you need to give us more weapons, you need to liberate us to use missiles deep into Russia. Let us and you together risk a major escalation because we can still win, and nobody in the West really believes this any longer. And I'll just show you quickly how, for quite a while now, this has been emerging. Here yesterday was the headline we showed you: Ukraine needs to be realistic about its goals, Czech president says. It was President Peter Pavel, a former NATO general, who has been vocal in his support for Ukraine, said Kiev needed to accept that some territory could remain under Russian control, at least, quote, temporarily. The Economist in the beginning part of this month, September 8th, had a headline, quote, danger in Donbass as Ukraine's front lines falter. Russian fighters are trying to encircle the defenders. In Politico, all the way back in November of last year, Ukraine's top general, war with Russia has reached a stalemate. Quote, there will be most likely no deep and beautiful breakthrough, he said. The New York Times, even at the beginning of the war, April 22nd, can Ukraine keep winning? As a new phase of the war begins, we look at Russia's advantages and Ukraine's. And it said, quote, Ukraine has defeated Russia in the first phase of the war and a second phase has begun. The bottom line, a quick victory by either side seems unlikely. Then again, war is often very difficult to predict. Now, As I mentioned, one of the very few people who has been warning of this over and over has been John Mearsheimer, who's been on our show many times. He's been on several shows. He was on a show called Uncensored. I believe this was earlier today. Oh, this is with Piers Morgan, actually. And I believe they're discussing Ukraine. So let's listen to what John Mearsheimer, who has every right to take victory laps in his prescience, had to say.
Because there's nothing that we can do to turn the tide on the battlefield in Ukraine.
There is.
We do
There is, though.
not have the ability.
We could give them the missiles they want.
The missiles are not going to make any difference. The idea that giving them ATACMS or Storm Shadows is going to turn the tide on the battlefield is not a serious argument. The Ukrainians are doomed. What really matters here are the number of troops, the number of artillery pieces on the front lines, and the amount of air power each side has over the battlefield. And there, the Russians have a decisive advantage, and that advantage is increasing by the day. And there's nothing we can do to reverse that. The Ukrainians are doomed. And given that the Ukrainians are doomed, the best thing to do at this point in time is put an end to the war. That's the morally correct position, at least from my point of view.
I'm Piers Morgan trying to argue war and military strategy with John Mearsheimer is like watching a 4-year-old trying to debate any kind of issue with an adult. I mean, it's just not even a worthwhile conversation to have. Like, yeah, we can give them missiles. What is that going to do about the crumbling front line in eastern Ukraine, or about the massive difference in the number of troops each has? And Mearsheimer has been saying this from the start, and he has proven to be true. That's why he's banned basically from mainstream media. He goes on Piers Morgan. He used to be on a lot of other stations. He's never on them now. He basically speaks on independent media because that's the only place where he can get on because of his heresy on Ukraine, but he's been right all along. In contrast to people like Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who as recently as March of this year was telling the BBC, quote, "The Ukraine war, Ukraine can absolutely win against Russia," says Blinken. Quote, asked if he was convinced Ukraine could win, he said, "Over time, absolutely. I can't tell you how long this will go on. I can't tell you how long it will take, but the idea that Russia can subjugate to its will 45 million people who are ardently fighting for their future and their freedom, that does not involve Russia having its thumb on Ukraine. That tells you a lot." And then here is Nancy Pelosi, who was also assuring Americans that we have to win and will win.
Happened to this war, this counteroffensive is making inroads, but it's slower than I think a lot of people expected. I mean, how have you been seeing this counteroffensive play out on the ground?
The counteroffensive, by admission of the Ukrainians, has not.
By the way, that reminds me about the counteroffensive. In 2023, the war was looking terrible for the Ukrainians. And what we were told was, oh no, don't worry. There's this gigantic counteroffensive coming from the Ukrainians that's going to push the Russians way back. And all those same people who were telling us in the middle of the Iraq war, don't worry, we have a surge coming, we're going to win. People like David Petraeus and Max Boot in the Washington Post, all these people were saying, oh no, this counteroffensive is going to come and it's going to crush the Russians, push them all the way back. And the counteroffensive was a bloody failure. The Ukrainians lost so many people, and it barely changed anything, to the point where even people like Nancy Pelosi are forced to admit, oh yeah, the counteroffensive really wasn't as good as we were hoping.
The counteroffensive, by admission of the Ukrainians, has not gone as quickly or strongly as they had hoped, but that doesn't mean it won't. We have to make sure that the counteroffensive works. We must win this war. It must be won. And we cannot not win because we have withheld something. So the NATO countries, including the United States, have to, one way or another, make sure that the Ukrainians have what they need to win the war.
I mean, this is the thing they've been saying for so long. It has been completely detached from all of reality. And they knew they couldn't win the war. They wanted the war to continue. They wanted to transfer billions of dollars to the war machine, to the big arms manufacturers that control Washington with their lobbyists and the revolving door, to make sure that the United States and NATO continue to project force, and most of all, they thought they were going to weaken the Russians, when in fact the Russian economy and the Russian military are now strengthened, as is the Russian alliance with both Iran and China. Brilliant, brilliant as always. Here's Joe Biden back in December of last year talking about this war as well.
Look, I know we have our divisions at home. Let's get past them. This is critical. Petty, partisan, angry politics can't get in the way of our responsibility as a leading nation in the world. The entire world is watching. The entire world is watching. What will the United States do? And think if we don't support Ukraine, what's the rest of the world going to do? What's Japan going to do, which is supporting Ukraine now? What's going to happen in terms of the G7? What's going to happen in terms of our NATO allies? What are they going to do? If we walk away now, it'll only embolden other would-be aggressors. So I'm calling on Congress to do something and do the right thing, to stand with the people of Ukraine, stand against the tyranny of Putin, stand for freedom, literally stand for freedom. Let's get this done.
All right, so it didn't get done. And actually, the war in Ukraine, sponsored by the US and NATO, have been viewed in much of the world as yet another attempt by the United States to rule the war by force. It has driven much of the world further into the arms of China and into the BRICS alliance, and has alienated the world even further, even just as, even more so, the US support for the war in Israel. So this is everything that happened. This is what has been said. And now you're seeing this pivot where they're never going to admit that they lost or that everything that they said had been wrong. You're going to hear things like what we heard from Richard Haass, like, yeah, we just never clearly defined victory, unfortunately, and that is exactly what we need to do. And if it were only this war, it'd be one thing, but this is the pattern of every war, and that's why it's so critical. And I remember talking about this a lot, too, that war propaganda is the most emotionally manipulative thing that can be dispensed, because you hear about the evil Russians invading the Ukrainians, about civilians in Ukraine being killed, which, you know, is basically true in terms of the Russians going over the border and killing Ukrainian civilians. Certainly nowhere near the number of civilians being killed in Gaza, but nonetheless. And then you are worked up into this kind of anger, like, we can't stand for this. We have to go do something. We're the United States. We have to go fight for freedom. And especially in those moments when you get worked up, when you're emotionally manipulated into supporting the government and wanting to feel part of this kind of tribalistic, nationalistic unity and fervor, that's when skepticism is the most urgent. You have to fight in order to do that, because every time we don't, this is the history of what ends up happening. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.